Well, good morning, everybody. This has been an amazing conference. I don't know if you're like me, but I woke up this morning and practiced my gratitude exercise. I was grateful for all the usual suspects, but particularly grateful for the excellent job that John has done. I think he's been amazing. Very grateful for the hospitality that the organizers have shown. And somewhat grateful for the challenge that the conference organizers have given the speakers, which is to take a 20-year career and try and distill it down into 18 minutes. They've certainly been very good at helping move me along that curve into the optimum stress zone and hopefully not into the de-stressed zone. I'm going to tell you a series of stories, and the story of the work that I've been doing actually has a link here at the Mayo Clinic, and it's related to this machine, which is a machine that was developed by Dr. John Kirkland in 1955 here at the Mayo Clinic, and it was the machine that was responsible for the first successful series of open heart operations in the United States. And that's an important part of the story because I think Dr. Kirkland's innovation and spirit of innovation was rooted in the Mayo Clinic back in the 50s. He went on to become the chairman of cardiac surgery here and then went to the University of Alabama, where many years later I had the opportunity to come to the United States to do fellowship work with him. I'm one of those kids who in elementary school knew that I wanted to be a doctor. By the time I was in high school, I knew I wanted to be a surgeon. And by the time I got into medical school, I knew that I wanted to be a cardiac surgeon because I thought that the absolute cutting edge, if you pardon the pun, of surgery was transplantation surgery. In fact, that's what I'm trained how to do heart transplant surgery. And I actually went on to do sub-fellowship work in pediatric heart surgery at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. When I was with Dr. Kirkland, and I think because he was such a pioneer, he insisted that his trainees actually spend time on what's called the harvest team. Usually you learn how to put the heart into the patient, and then you learn to focus on how to keep the patient from rejecting the heart. But for 3 months, I got him fixed-wing aircraft, Learjets, helicopters, and flew throughout the southeastern United States, harvesting 1 to 2 hearts a day. And I had never stopped to think where the donors come from. I'd always been focused on the miracle of transplantation, but I quickly began to appreciate that all of our donors come out of people who are very healthy one moment, having a great time with their lives, and then as a result of being hurt, are brain dead the next. And I got to the point where I just couldn't stomach taking the hearts out of people who should actually be keeping those hearts in order to have a vibrant and healthy life. Went back to the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, and as a hobby more than anything, started trying to collect information on who was being hurt in our society. And back in the early 90s, we didn't have a way to code injury. If you came into hospital and you had pneumonia, a heart attack, bowel cancer, we recorded it. But if you were hurt, nobody recorded it. And so I began to collect information, and the information that I found just blew me out of the water. Now, I've updated some of the statistics that I found because now we do have data, and these are statistics in the United States. And in the next 3 minutes, 1 person is going to die. In fact, 1 person dies from unintentional injury in the United States every 3 minutes. 5 people are hurt so seriously that they go into hospital every minute, and 62 visits a minute in the United States into the emergency room are as a result of injury, people being hurt. It's the leading cause of death for Americans up to age 44. You can take every cause of death you've ever heard of in children, add them all together, and we have more children dying of preventable injury than everything else combined. And 75% of all the teenagers who die in this country every year die as the result of injury. And yet very, very few people know that. And so I began to ask myself, why? Why is this? Why is it? And to make a long story short, I was going on and on every day in the operating room about the magnitude of the problem, and finally, one day, the head of cardiac surgery at Sick Kids said, "Look, Robert, if you feel strongly about this, do something about it." Now that I'm a little older, a little wiser, I realized that he was really just saying, "Shut up." But the challenge became, what can you do? And ultimately, I turned down a fellowship to go to the Loma Linda, California to do children's transplants, stopped practicing surgery, and created this not-for-profit organization called SMARTRISK. I'm going to share with you the 3 things that I've learned about trying to shift a paradigm. And the first thing I learned was the power of language. How we talk about things shapes how we think, and how we think shapes how we behave. And I came to realize that we call all of these things accidents. We've looked at 33 different languages, and the meaning is almost the same in each language. It's defined as an unavoidable act of fate. And why is that important? Well, we know from human behavior studies that when people think that something's fate, one of the best ways they cope with that is to go into denial. They convince themselves it will never happen to me. If I was to tell you that in 10 minutes, 5 of you would be dead, in the next 10 minutes, some of you would start to argue with me, some of you would start to feel a little bit anxious, some might actually start to feel a little physically unwell. The majority of you would spend the next 10 minutes looking around the room, picking out the 5 people that you thought were going to die. And you can bet that you yourself wouldn't be one of them. Denial is a powerful way of coping with the concept of fate. And so we live in a world where we use magical language to describe all of these things. There was a 2-car accident. The car went out of control, or the car crossed over the median, or the car flipped over, as though somehow these things just magically happen. The only place in our society where we don't use the word accident routinely is with planes. We call them plane crashes, and if there's even a near crash, we'll have a huge investigation to figure out why. And you'll never pick up a newspaper and read, today there was a plane accident, the plane fell out of the sky. It seems bizarre. And yet in every other area of our society, we call them accidents, and we tend to think that they just happen. The other powerful language that I began to realize when I started working with teenagers was that safety sucks. I don't think anybody here woke up this morning and said, I hope somebody's going to give me a talk on safety today. Safety isn't cool, it's for nerds in the minds of teenagers. And teenagers were the first group that I decided to work with. And so the second thing I realized that we needed to do, once we understood the power of language, and there's really many ways that that can be extrapolated into trying to understand who you're trying to talk to and speaking them in a language that resonates with them, we recognized that we need to reframe the issue. We had to take it from safety sucks to something completely different. How do we all learn about safety? Well, usually through rules. The challenge with rules is that most of us by the age of 5 realize that we can break the rule and nothing bad happens. Or we learn through don't messages, don't do this, don't do that. And so we decided to shift it into actually talking about choices with teenagers and talking about what you can do to actually keep from being hurt. We moved it from the language of safety into the language of risk and managing risk and helping young people understand that life is about taking risk. Everything we do has risk in it, whether it's driving, skiing, walking down the street, life is about taking risk. The challenge is most of us don't see the risk in our lives, but if we do, we help young people realize that they can actually make choices that will allow them to take those risks, and most importantly, take those risks so that there's benefit. Traditional safety is always, don't do that, you'll get hurt. Negative message, consequence focused. Everything else in our life is benefit focused. Come to this conference so you can meet lots of great people. Buy this Kleenex because it's 3 times stronger. Buy this car because it's got better fuel economy. Everything's benefit focused except in the world of safety. You know, almost every community I go into, I look to see how people advertise health clubs. And I've yet to find a single billboard with a grotty looking heart on it saying, come to our health club so your heart doesn't look like this. Instead, I see gigantic images of people that you either hope you're going to look like when you come out, or more likely people you hope you're going to meet when you go in. It's positioned in a way that makes you incented to want to be there. The third thing that we learned in trying to work with teenagers was to try and take our target audience and actually make them the messenger. So some of the first programming we developed was to distill all of the safety messages in the world into 5 simple messages, and we developed big traveling road shows that went into schools and made the concept of taking SMARTRISK vibrant. But we found that we were trying to talk to our target. And I began to have parents come and talk to me about the fact that they were pretty convinced that their young child would make a good decision if they were by themselves, but when they were with their peers, they were very frightened that they would make a bad choice. And so we started learning everything we could about the nature of peer pressure and decided to create a program that we called No Regrets. And we decided to try and create it in a way that we would make our target audience the actual messenger. So what we do is we have a tool that schools use to select students to form a core site team, 6 people on the core site team. We bring groups of those 6 kids together for a 2-day intensive training program with experiential learning. We teach them about injury prevention, we teach them about the SMARTRISK concepts, but we teach them how to budget, we teach them how to project plan, we teach them how to deal with conflict resolution, we teach them how to deal with the media, and we talk to them about creativity. We then put them back in their schools, and they form a larger team using a template that we've developed. And that team is then charged with creating 10 events over the course of the year that makes the concept of taking SMARTRISK cool and fun and exciting. There are no messages about don't, no messages about fear or scaring people. It's all about the concept of making the taking of risk fun and exciting so that people understand there's a benefit. Now, what we stumbled across was some research that Health Canada did that showed that in an average Canadian school, there are 15 different psychodemographic groups of kids. The kids that are interested in science, the kids interested in music, the jocks, etc. And we discovered through some work that we did that if we created a core site team with at least 6 psychodemographic groups represented, we could change the entire school culture. I think too often when we develop programming to go into schools, we ask for volunteers. We often get the volunteers who already buy into our message, and they form a clique that preaches to the converted. And we found that by creating teams that were made up of kids that would never, ever associate with one another, but became a team through promoting the messages that they developed, we could have major impact on the entire school culture. And in fact, in some of the communities, they actually had impact on local political culture by changing the way in which either regulations were set or where stop signs were put, by focusing in on where the actual problems were and coming up with creative solutions to make change. Could give you lots of examples of how we work with young people, but I'm going to talk about one other audience that we work with a little bit different, and this is the fire service. And this came about because of a talk that I was giving to a group of teachers, and discovered that in the audience was somebody who was the fire marshal. I talked about the fact that firemen really don't do prevention work. They actually do fire management work, because smoke detectors require a fire to get people out of the building in the first place. We started looking at what was actually causing deaths in the province of Ontario. We discovered that almost all the children who died as a result of an adult falling asleep, either having had too much to drink or being tired, with a cigarette and setting the house on fire. Almost every fireman you talk to will tell you the dirty little secret that this is the one area in our society where we not only ignore what essentially is child abuse, but we reward it. When those situations happen, the community galvanizes and raises money, buys a new house, and buys new possessions for the family. We wanted the firemen to become public spokesmen for that. We realized after talking to them that there was no way that they would substitute their hero status for shining the spotlight on this. So we made them the messengers. They went and met with federal politicians, laid out all of the information, and in less than 6 months, we're able to bring in national legislation that has now made self-extinguishing cigarettes mandatory. The incidence of child death related to fire has plummeted. I think at the basis of the 3 things that I've talked about, it's re-engaging the thing that we all know as 2-year-olds, which is to ask why and to keep asking why. But there's a huge challenge here in terms of shifting public thinking. And I'm going to close by an analogy that I think really illustrates just how far we have to go to shift the way that the public thinks about this thing, accident, and to illustrate just how embedded the concept of the word accident is in our society. And that's to talk about the death of 2 celebrities and to contrast them. Now, it's not important if you know who John Candy was, but he was a Canadian. He was a famous comedian that did well in the United States. He was on Saturday Night Live, National Lampoon, Animal House, etc. It's not important that you know that. It's not important that you know that he died of a heart attack at the age of 44. He was a big guy. But most people aren't surprised when I tell them that in the 6 months after his death, Heart and Stroke Foundation in Canada and in the United States raised more money in that 6 months than they had in the preceding year. And I could give you all sorts of examples where a celebrity dies of a major disease and people respond by contributing to try and fund the cure or try and fund research. Well, contrast that with the death of somebody else, Diana, Princess of Wales. When Diana died, there was a lot in the media about paparazzi and the role that they played in her death. There was a little bit about alcohol, a little bit about speed. But there was nothing in the media, and we looked worldwide, there was nothing in the media about the choice that Diana made that night. And I'm talking about the choice of wearing a seatbelt. How many people in the room have their driver's license? Virtually everybody. Well, I know from some research we've done that if you wear your seatbelt every time you drive your car, You are less likely to put on your seatbelt if you get into the back seat of a friend's car. You're even less likely to put on a seatbelt if you get into a taxi cab. Just think about that, the last time you got into a taxi. And I can guarantee you almost that if a limousine pulled up in front of the Civic Center and you had an opportunity to get into it, you wouldn't put on a seatbelt. We just don't see the risk in our lives, and so we don't make choices that help us manage that risk. If I put on my cardiac surgeon's hat for a second, when that car stopped traveling at whatever ridiculous speed it was going, Diana continued to travel at the same speed inside the car until she hit the seat in front of her. And when she hit that seat, her internal organs continued to travel at the same speed inside her body until her heart and her lungs hit her breastbone. And because our heart and our lungs are of a slightly different mass, they moved at a slightly different speed, and they tore apart. And she bled to death. And that's an injury that we just don't see if you're wearing a seatbelt, because all the energy of slowing down gets transmitted through the seatbelt into the frame of the vehicle. How do we react as a society? Well, not a single penny, not a single dollar was raised or spent on injury prevention. Instead, globally, we went out and we spent millions of dollars, millions of British pounds on flowers. And I don't have anything against florists, but it seems to me to be an incredibly ridiculous way for us to respond if we recognize and appreciate that these things are actually predictable and preventable, but also an illustrative example of how firmly fixed the concept of these being accidents is in our mindset. I'm going to close with one last thing. The text behind this stage pointed out that that's kind of an appropriate phrase, given that I'm using Keynote, which is the Apple product, and I think in about an hour, Apple's going to be doing their presentation and unveiling a bunch of products, and I think Steve Jobs actually used to always conclude with one more thing, so it's a little bit of a change on that. But if nothing I have said has shifted your thinking and understanding that you can move paradigms by understanding who you're trying to talk to and the power of language, reframing the issue, and finding a way to make your messenger, the target audience, the messenger, then I'm going to close hopefully with something that may resonate with you, because most of you have indicated that you're drivers, and to show you that you can, in 30 seconds, reframe things in a way that can shift the way in which people think. Most importantly, hopefully it will make you think in a way that might actually save your life.
Move it. Let's go. Step on it.
Go, come on, go. You'd never walk like this. So why would you drive like this? You'd never swing like this. So why would you drive like this?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll be wearing my seatbelt back to the airport today, that's for sure. A couple of great comments. Blown away by Dr. Conn's talk. Thank you for sharing. Outstanding fit under the paradigm session. Nice example of reframing and shifting paradigm, leading to change in behavior and ultimately health. And a living kidney donor wanted to say how much he or she really loved your talk. As a surgeon, surgeons are known for being very confident, right? I'm right about that.
You're
right?
You're right.
Yeah, right. And Canadian surgeons are known about being
humbly
confident. That's right. Yeah. So you know, you're the perfect person to ask this, and it's slightly off topic, but how do you, and someone who's experienced an accident, which we always call an accident, when I was a teenager, and I was engaging in the high-risk behavior of hitchhiking on a road in Pennsylvania, and I didn't die, but I certainly came very near death 38 years ago. You know, there was a lot of concern about, you know, the idea of wouldn't it have been great if you didn't have this accident? And of course, over the last 38 years, I've had to live with the consequences of the accident. And so how do you develop a risk prevention, accident prevention strategy without conferring a stigma on someone who is the victim of an accident, but who also is living a perfectly full life? And we have to understand that accidents are going to happen and people are going to move on. And people shouldn't necessarily look at those people and go, oh, man, bad luck.
I'm going to answer that two ways, John. Because I really, your opening comments at the conference where you're talking about how people get labeled, and you were talking about the fact that you were often referred to as a T4 paraplegic. When I first started doing this work, I started working with lots of young people who had been injured. And one of the first programs we developed, we took people into the high schools. And many of those young people had been labeled as victims of a horrible accident. And it just didn't make sense to me. We changed it and talked to people that had been hurt as being injury survivors. And talked about the incredible gift that they brought by having survived something very traumatic in their lives. But there are very few injury survivors I've met who given the choice, wouldn't rather not be injured. And I think that you can talk about these things in a way that doesn't lay blame and doesn't make people feel disadvantaged by recognizing at the very fundamental core, we live in a society right now where we just don't see the risk. And because we don't see that risk, we don't talk about it in a way that actually helps manage the risk. Let me give you one example. 6 months into doing this work, I got a phone call from a reporter because a 6-month-old child had strangled on a blind cord in the bedroom. And the reporter called and said, I understand you've created this organization. Do you have any stats on how often this happens? And I said, well, actually, there is some information that I've found, and I can tell you that about 12 kids a year die as a result of this, and we know how they die. It's because mom or dad puts the crib up against the wall, under the window, and the blind cord dangles into the crib, and at 6 months of age, the child starts to sit up, they get their head caught in it, they fall over, and they strangle. And I said, could you write the story to help every parent, every grandparent understand this? And the reporter said, I can't do that. Because if I do that, I'll be blaming the parents that this happened to. So I'm just going to report the statistics. And that shocked me. So I actually phoned up the parents. I'd never met them. And I said, I'm doing this work, and I'd like to try and help ensure that nobody else has to go through what you've gone through. Would you be willing to talk to the reporter? And I brought the reporter to meet the parents. And of course, they said, we would do anything we could to make sure that no other family's going through what we're going through. And for me, that was a really pivotal learning point because it took that much work to get the reporter comfortable enough to talk about it in a preventive way to help save lives. Because so often we think when people get hurt that there's some blame attached or some big mistake, as opposed to realizing that as a society we just don't see risk and manage it in a way that's helpful.
It's like the language exercise. Take the nerdiness out of safety, take the blame and guilt out of the accident survivor concept, and suddenly it's a whole different conversation.
Correct. It becomes a conversation of empowerment and life. I could care less why kids are wearing bike helmets or putting on their seatbelt as long as they're doing it. And if they're doing it, one of the most exciting things is that when we go into schools that we've worked in and we ask kids, why do you wear your seatbelt? We're very likely to get answers like, because I want to make it to the party and have fun, or because I want to be a radio announcer, or because I want to be an engineer. They're all future-focused rationales for engaging that behavior. It's not because there's a rule. It's not because I don't want to get hurt. It's because it's an action I can take that actually helps me do the things that I want to do.
You nailed the 18-minute time limit within 15 seconds. Is that because you're a surgeon or because you're a Canadian?
Both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.